All right, we are recording. BJ, always great to
Gustavo,
see you. Thank you
good to
so
see
much for
you
being
too,
here.
pal. Thank you. I'm very excited for this thing you're putting out in the world, brother. I'm really
Thank you.
happy for, well, I should say happy for you. I'm happy for all of us.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I hope that I can live up to expectations and that we can make a difference and make an impact on the community.
No doubt. No doubt.
So, I I'm just going to put this out there now just for our listeners to understand. Your story has been well told before in many platforms, many people.
Hmm.
You've already said what you've had to say at the highest level. My interest in talking to you today is to explore some new territory, to dive into
Mhm.
some new topics, and then to see what you've been up to and get a feel for what's going on with mental health. Does that sound good?
That sounds great. Yeah.
Awesome. So I have been curious about I know that you studied art in college, and I'm interested right now in, like, what is your relationship right now to art? Is it something that is still a big part of your life? Is it something that
Hmm.
you still appreciate work in? Can you talk a little bit
Mhm.
about that?
Yeah, man. I love, well, thank you. You touched on one of my favorite subjects to talk about. Um, art for me is definitely a part of my life. Um, I love to live with art. I love like hunting for it, collecting it. I love being around it. I love like I often will go to, well, these days not so much, but pre and soon to be post pandemic. If I didn't just jinx anything, it will. I look forward to getting back to museums. It's funny. And it was this way when I studied it in college too. It's not that no single art piece is, I mean, there are certain art pieces of art that I that really speak to me and that I particularly love, but it's so much of my interest in it is sort of the idea of art. I love that art exists. I love that the human impulse to create things from our experience. And so much of the inspiration or poignancy that I derive from art is simply that. It's a reminder of being human is, among other ways of looking at it, a creative act that we find our way, we create our lives to some degree, we respond to things, we make things from what we were given, we improvise throughout any one day. That there's just a beautiful, I think the creative lens is a beautiful way to approach being alive in this world. It's one of the things that makes me um, very happy to be a human being. Sometimes I look at my dog or the cats I live with or other animals or trees, and sometimes I feel a little jealous of other creatures in the world. Being a human being is tricky. But the fact that art exists is one of those things that really makes me love being human and loves humanity. So yeah, there's a little whirlwind of an answer to your question, but we can go anywhere from there in more specifics.
Yeah, so I is there a specific form of art that you're more drawn to, or is it just obviously I can see that you appreciate it as a
Mhm.
general act of creativity, but
Mhm.
is there some form of it that speaks to you more?
Yeah. Yeah. So for traditionally for me, music has been really, if we're talking about the arts broadly, like music has throughout my life been the nearest dearest, the most direct way in to for me. Like I studied a bunch of different musical instruments as a kid, and that certainly helped foment my interest. But like I think for a lot of us, music just speaks to us in ways that are, you know, unique, and it's immediate. There's an emotional pull. You don't it. I don't have to think about music. It's fun to analyze. Like studying art history was fun to analyze things and contextualize them historically and hunt for, why did someone make it sound like this or look like this and all that stuff. I am interested in that. But that's sort of separate. I'm interested in the creative process, like we were talking, but also just the feeling of being around art. I started to say a minute ago, now I'm going all over the place, but I started to say a minute ago, I love to go to museums just to be, or galleries, just to be around art. I often find times will go whiz through very quickly. I don't necessarily need to do much there or stare at any one piece of art. I just like being near it. It sort of has a vibe of its own. And similarly with music, early on, early on, I think, I think this is probably very common. The things that I most appreciated, the kinds of music, the kinds of painting, the kinds of art in general that spoke to me, were the ones that were sort of accessible to me. So musically, I've always loved, because I used to sing pretty seriously in a choir. Like I loved if I could reproduce it. If I could sing a song, then then I like that song, in a way it somehow related to my own experience. And that was a way in. So in some ways earlier, art was this safe thing, this thing that I could recognize from my own experience. And music was a big part of that. And specifically music with a melody and a harmony and things that I could track and reproduce myself. But then as I got older and I was around more of life and experience, then I became much more interested in music and other art that didn't immediately speak to me, that I didn't immediately recognize. Became a way for me to pull out of my experience, and rather than going into my experience. Like early on, it became a way for me to go into the experience of others, or go into places that were uncomfortable, or dissonance with music, things that actually didn't sound lovely and pretty and easy to sing. Complicated rhythms and modern music, atonal music, tight, weird harmonies, early polyphony like medieval and Renaissance music. So increasingly, I'm interested in art that may speak to me and hit me on some level, but art that I don't understand. That's become much more interesting to me. And so similarly, as I've gotten into more visual arts, it used to be like this painting behind me, Gustavo, you can see, it's a pastel of a landscape. It's a pretty picture, but that's a sentimental thing to me. That's a place I know. And so it's fun for me to see a painting of a place I know in sort of sentimental reasons. That's lovely and sort of decorative in a way, but there's certain art that the big stuff that really gets me deep is much more tends to be more abstract, that I'm not seduced into being, am I interested in this painting because it's portraying a landscape that I know, or am I interested in her technique, or what? In the abstract stuff, like, you don't recognize a place. It pulls you out of your narrative. And I'm increasingly interested in that. It pulls me to places I don't know, that I don't understand. So with all that backed up, um, the older I've gotten, the more interested I am in abstraction, odd stuff, weird stuff, not recognizable to me.
I mean, there's so many layers there. My music has always been important to me too, but I have come to love classical music so much
Mm.
because it took effort to actually understand it. It was not
Right.
approachable. I didn't get it. I'd start out by just listening to the same piece in the background five, six, seven, 10 times, and
Mhm.
then I would go listen to it seriously, and it was an exploration. So I think part of it, right, if I'm reading it correctly, is you're exploring new aspects of yourself, new aspects of life, different narratives. But
Right
I
on.
think that right, there's also the sense of, again, tell me if I'm reading this wrong, but there's also a sense of approaching something and trying to master it and trying to understand it, that
Mhm.
maybe was alien to you before, and now you're diving into it to understand something else about yourself or the world around you.
Right on. That's yeah. That's a great way of putting it, Gustavo. I feel total kinship with that statement. I mean, I guess the only word I'd change would be master it. I do. I do love making the unfamiliar familiar. You can almost feel like, I bet you've had this feeling with classical music. It as you notice with each listening, you notice more and more, even though it was always there, you notice a little bit more, and then it becomes familiar. And then when you hear it, you can kind of finish the stanza, you can finish the song yourself. And I do love that process of taking this foreign thing outside of myself and beginning to relate to it, and then pulling it inside myself so that it becomes familiar. Then that artwork sets up in me as in my memory bank somewhere as part of my own makeup. So it's a way for me to stretch and pull and understand things. And even if I don't understand it cognitively, it's almost, I guess, almost like make it my own, have my own experience with that. I guess it's a little different from mastering per se, in my idea. So I'm just I'm picking on you a little bit, but otherwise that statement,
yeah, mastering is probably out of place there, but yeah, no, but the thought just struck me, right? That there's an analogy there with disability and those narratives, and like the awkwardness that people face when they first encounter it. There, I think there's some interesting parallels there if we can think of approaching people with disabilities the way we approach learning a new art form or learning something that we're unfamiliar with. I think there's some interesting lessons to tease out of there.
Totally. Amen. I think you're right on about that. Lots to say about that. Yep.
Please do.
Okay. Because there's something about art. A couple of things, a couple of thoughts. One is like, by virtue of having a calling something art, that means that's what is art? It's an important question. We could get sidetracked too long, but quick tangent, like what the heck is art? What's the difference between art and is a brick? Can a brick piece be a piece of art? I mean, so intention seems to matter, context seems to matter a lot, and the intention of the artist seems to matter a lot. But what is art is an interesting question, in part because we can see our own lives as works of art. We can see anybody's life as a creation, as a work of art. And by virtue of calling it art, it almost, it out of the chutes, even if you don't respond to it or like it per se, it has some respect by virtue of it. It exists in the world. It's there whether you're looking at it or not. It doesn't need you, but it will relate with you. And there's a way into art that can sidestep a lot of the stuff that comes up between humans. And again, you're starting from a place of respect. You're starting from a place of seeking and trying to understand it rather than making it come to you. And I think there's a lot to be said about approaching any human being that way, the respect that it confers, the curiosity, the humility, and absolutely extra poignant, I would suppose, in approaching someone with a disability or any difference from your own experience. But more specifically with disability, because I think as you and I have talked, the differences that by which we're defined as disabled people, for us can be grist, not this sort of sad, poor, oh, woe is me, this thing that I don't have, this thing that I wish it were normal. I don't mean to castigate that impulse to try to fit in and be normal. We all have that. But there's also something to push back on that. What is this thing that is normal? And why do we have to frame things in reference to something else? Artwork, if you're doing it historically, you'll compare and contrast, but art has a way of existing for its own sake, and you're not trying to make it something it's not. I wish we did that with each other, especially around disability, to see it as this thing that, as a bystander, you may not understand, but have curiosity about it, have respect for it, acknowledge its existence. One of the kindest things we can do is acknowledge each other's reality. But another way, one of the harshest things we can do to each other is to deny each other our reality. And playing with art, sitting with art, sinking into it, spending the time around it, that just brings a totally different mindset of creativity and respect. I know I'm repeating myself. So anyway, that yes, I'm super with you on all levels. And also, like, even more specifically, like, for me as an amputee, right? I have my prosthetic legs. And for me, it was a huge breakthrough in my own sort of therapeutic arc. My own, basically trying to inhabit my own reality, come to terms with my life. Um, that's why I studied art, Gustavo. Actually, it was a kind of a hunch that studying art had something for me to learn. There was something for me to learn in the ways that we've been talking, and it was a good hunch. So when I started looking at my prosthetic leg as a creation unto itself, as its own thing, not a cheap replacement for this thing that I had lost, but rather its own thing, I could start seeing it all of a sudden as something that was beautiful, and something I could be curious about, something I could play with. That was a huge breakthrough for me just personally. It shifted how I saw myself. And that came directly, well, in part fueled by my mom's experience and a basic understanding of disability as a civil right, et cetera. But studying art was the thing, specifically modern architecture, where they were pulling all the old, like the applique, the decoration off of a building. And it used to be the norm would be you would hide the structural elements of a building. You'd cover it up with moldings and carvings and ornate stuff and beautiful stuff, but it was a covering, it was a cosmesis, you know and modern art, it was a big breakthrough with Louis Sullivan and others, was to pull all that stuff off and quit trying to make it some narrow, lame version of pretty. Like, let's blow it up. Like, humans have bigger capacity than just pretty, like. And so we started pulling all the applique off buildings and started celebrating the structural bits for their own sake. That really rocked me. That was so beautiful. That day I came home from this modern architecture class, pulled these sort of faux flesh colored foam coverings off my prostheses that were, meant to help you pass, right? They kind of looked like a leg ostensibly. So they're trying to help you pretend. So here, breakthrough here was, stop pretending, man. This is an unusual leg. This is a different leg, but it's a cool leg in its own right. It's got its own forces, its own life. And that was just, for me, just a huge moment. Anyway, I can't now remember which question I'm answering, but
No, we're just talking. So
yeah, okay, good.
This is
Sorry,
good.
man. Welcome to
There's
my brain.
there's so much to say here and tease out, right? Because I studied philosophy in college and
Mm-hmm.
graduate school, and I was fortunate that my professors, in the way they taught, you didn't criticize an ancient philosopher until
Mm-hmm.
you learned to understand what it was they were actually trying to say. So
Mm-hmm.
there was a respect and appreciation for what you were engaging with, right? And you had the same thing in art, same thing in
Mm-hmm.
architecture. It's amazing to me that we have this incredible capacity to engage in these ways with these subject matters. And when it
Mm-hmm.
comes to apply it to human beings, it's like everything shuts off and we go into animal instinct or whatever it is we do.
Yeah, man, that's so true. It's kind of stunning. I have this feeling a lot, like, of meeting, like, if I especially, like, when we are in our undergraduate days and like our graduate school, all that stuff, like, you're around people who are applying so much devotion and thoughtfulness to these subjects. um, but you take that, they would stop, they wouldn't apply that same introspection and respect and seeking to their own lives, nor to the lives of others. This major disconnect, and it's not just a disconnect, but it's a tragic one, because if we gave each other that same respect that we can give subject matter like we do, whew, what a different place. And I don't know why we don't. It seems like such an easy, take that way of thinking and being and feeling and just simply apply it to the rest of your life. Why
Yeah.
do you save that kind of beautiful way of being for the classroom and keep it out of real life? I have no idea. Do you have any ideas of why the hell we do that?
I think that's a complicated question, probably beyond my, I mean, there's lots of reasons. One idea is just we don't, I think the way our consciousness forms, the way we're culturally raised, right? We're hard on
Hmm.
ourselves. We
Hmm.
don't think of ourselves in the same way as we think of other people.
Hmm.
Um, Maybe we're not aware. It's a lack of awareness that
Hmm.
I'm trained to do this specific thing and learn this specific pattern here, but I don't know, maybe there's something in our brains, something in in our consciousness, in our humanity, in our culture that
Hmm.
just prevents us from applying it to ourselves. I mean, some people have clearly done it more than
Hmm.
others. Some people do treat people with more of that curiosity, more of that openness of
Yeah.
wanting to engage with another person and understand them and learn
Hmm.
from them and grow from it. So it's definitely
Hmm.
possible, but
Hmm.
that's a huge question. I'm not sure.
I'm not either, brother. I mean, but I do think God does give us a little bit of a compass, like as a way that we might there's of seeking pre-existing ways of being, ways of thinking, and applying them more broadly. Like I do think that we're in a time of sort of like I'm not interested in no new stuff for a while. I'd love to see a moratorium on innovation for a while to force us all to actually work with what already exists. I think we get this momentum going, and we are attracted to the next shiny object, and we blow past all sorts of stuff.
Yeah,
So I almost long for a moratorium on innovation for, I don't know, a couple years to force us to slow down, pay attention to what we already have, because what we already have is huge. I mean, just like on this note, I mean, we could, looking around for ways of thinking and feeling. Well, we have them in all these beautiful classrooms. There's plenty to draw from. So I'm with you. There's something about momentum. There's something about context. Context switching. We need to make that a very conscious activity. Um, so the context of a classroom or a studies versus the rest of life. Um, so not getting hung up, or more realizing that we have some say over how we place the frame of reference, the field of view. We can change the context. Is another way of experience a thing, is playing with its context. So seeing even that as a creative pursuit. And then I guess the last little hunch here together would be, as social animals, the expectations, and it relates to context. So, but as social animals, the expectations in a social setting are different from a classroom. And I think if we just spent a moment there, we could open that up and make those switches conscious, and blow it up a little bit. But anyway, I'm with you. I don't know exactly. I don't know exactly why it is the case, why human beings do really just about anything that we do. But boy, it seems awfully tantalizing to think that God, salvation is waiting for us with this stuff right in, like, under our noses, the things that we even already know, just need to apply them a little differently or more broadly or something like that.
absolutely. And I think the idea of time is the way we use it, how much of it we have. Obviously, we only have so much, but we're
Mhm.
always in a rush. It's more and more and more. It's go, go,
Mhm.
go. So if we actually took the time, made the time, created the space to sit or socialize, engage in a community with of people,
Mhm.
maybe that light bulb would come on.
Amen.
Yeah.
Amen. I wish we'd sort of like, yeah, I mean, we'll just repeat ourselves. Right. I mean, it's just like, it seems to be so much about paying attention. If we can find a way to pay attention, and that's at odds with the speed, as you just described, at which we're moving. It doesn't allow us to settle into things, and we just don't notice stuff. And that seems like a big shame, especially in the context of realizing, as you and I do, that we are mortal. We're not here forever. So, boy, we do squander a fair amount of time, though. Oof.
We do. We do. But
Mhm.
I think the other point that you were talking about that was really interesting is the
Mm.
idea, that realization you had of not hiding the prosthetic, of having
Mhm.
it be a part of you, of And
Mhm.
when I was young, the prosthesis was something and the brace was something that I used to get around, and it was what it was. As I got
Mhm.
older, um, yes, it was less cosmetic, and I felt it become more of a part of my body. And I think it's also
Mhm.
interesting to explore, how do you express yourself in your
Mhm.
prosthetics by what you're doing versus me versus somebody else, right? There's people
Mhm.
who are incredible athletes, they're expressing it in one way. There's people who maybe they're into dance or some other, just just the way we move in the world, the way we express ourselves in the
Mhm.
world, it's it's different for all of us. And I think that's a really interesting point that you brought up.
Amen. Amen. Um, you know, there's like I don't know how you feel about the word aesthetics, Gustavo. I love that word. To me, it's so much a naming what we're talking about, because to go a little to settle into these funny legs of ours, you know, one of the ways, I don't know about you, but one of the ways that I have that has allowed me to settle into it um, is to see its aesthetic, its look and feel, its fit and finish, the material, the qualities of the material, the honesty of it. Like, can I see the mechanism in action, or am I covering it up, or am I hiding something? And there's nothing wrong with like playfully hiding things. It can be a way I can imagine someone really delighting in playing with the reveal of a prosthesis, or applying that sort of craft, that loving craftsmanship. I've heard of people who get these cosmetic covers and then have little hairs inserted and veins, and it becomes a sculpture. That's not been my way, but hey, each their own. This, like you say, this can be individual expression in all this.
Yeah.
Variations on themes we all share, but individual expressions within these themes is what a huge potential. We're given this incredible raw material to play with. Unlike a lot of folks who have their quote unquote regular or normal feet, you and I, we have these. You can see this as adornment, we can as ornaments, and we can play with those, and we can. And another way of putting all that is by finding some way to get into them, to delight in them, this look, this feel, this touch, the effect, all of it, any of it. These are all for me anyway. I realize that these are those roots of fascination and playfulness and interact and engagement, of inhabiting your own life, and making it your own life. you know all these things are proxies or arrows that point us to a way of basically trying to find a way to love life, love our lives, love ourselves even. I know that's a big ask. um, but these are ways, these aesthetic routes are ways in to being to caring about your reality, and eventually maybe even loving it.
I couldn't agree more. For me, the word aesthetic is interesting. I think it depends on the context. It depends on who's saying it, and
Mhm.
kind of understanding their perspective more. Aesthetics can obviously be a terrible word, right? A very superficial thing, or
Right.
it can be as deep and profound as you're willing to make it, which you just showed right now.
Yeah.
For me, I think of it. I'm not a scientist, but I've always thought of it scientifically. What can I do with this? How can I express myself? What are my limits? How can I
Mhm.
push those limits? How can this be better? How can
Mhm.
I be better so that I can use it more effectively for the things that I want to do? And I
Mhm.
guess there's a certain aesthetic with that too.
There is. There is. And if these are ways in that I would encourage you to pay attention, well, once you're paying attention, you'll start noticing things, and you'll notice ways to tweak it, make it better, make it different, whatever. But you got to find some way to pay attention. And as you and I both know, that can be hard with physical differences and disabilities, in part because they can be very painful. In inherently, there are pains that go with this for a lot of us, and there's social pain that goes with it. There are a lot of forces that conspire to make us want to either deny our own experience or somehow not think about it. And of course, we know what happens when we are not paying attention to things. Uh, so as you're talking, these are ways of paying attention. Therefore, when you're paying attention, these are ways to optimize, maximize, take advantage of, appreciate, etc. And that's an extra. There's an extra big sale to us in the disabled world, I think, because otherwise our body is just a little bit more likely to be a source of pain or embarrassment or something that keeps us apart from ourselves,
Right.
and that seems to
Something
be a
we
big
something we have
problem.
to overcome, something we have to prove
Right,
that we're still worthy, all of those things that are attached to it.
right. Somehow put behind us or whatever it is. Right on. Yep.
Yeah. Interesting. I would like to shift a little bit because the 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 connection that I want to draw is what we've talked about right now about disability, about our experiences, about our aesthetic, mindfulness.
Hmm.
So I've worked with you on a couple of sessions and I'm going to do more, and
Hmm.
we've had some really good talks, helpful
Hmm.
discussions um, through Mettle Health, which is your project now. And I would like to maybe use a little bit of my situation with you to kind of
Hmm.
highlight some of the things you're doing that, yes, you're still in the palliative care field, but mental health is so much more than that. And I'd really, if it's okay with you, I'd like to kind of dive into your work, but kind of use me as an example so people can get a better understanding of what you're
Yeah,
up to, what you're trying to do.
that'd be beautiful. I'd love that, and I really appreciate you going personal, Gustavo. That's. I wish the rest of the world found a way to do that. It's a totally adds a whole other dimension. So I really appreciate your willingness. So yes, let's dive in.
Awesome. So I reached out to you. We had a session, and uh, can you just give people, like, give the listeners just a quick,
Yeah,
2 minute idea of what mental health is and what you're trying to do?
yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So Mettle Health, first it's spelled Mettle, metal, as in like one's inner strength, one's inner reserve. So mettlehealth.com is an online palliative care counseling and coaching business that my partner Sonia and I started last year, about a year ago or so. Um, so that's the main, that's what that is. But you got to have to understand what palliative care is, and we can get into the weeds a little bit. But that's the marquee. But settling into what we actually do. So a couple different things about our model. One is that it, palliative care is an amazing approach to health and approach to care. So it's something of a philosophy, and it tends to be it is born in the healthcare, the medical model, but there's much about it that is not medical. And one of the things for me was I left my clinical work at UCSF, where I was working in the cancer center for many years doing palliative care. We called it the symptom management service, but that was very much to a medical model. And there's a lot to say about the medical model. But suffice to say, at least for now, that the medical model leaves a lot of stuff out. And the medical model tends to pathologize people. And the medical model, as you and I both know, has been a mixed blessing for us in the disability world. Um, there are other ways of looking at of understanding a life besides just the sort of biosciences, and there's more to an experience in a life than just sort of a diagnosis or a disease state. So mental health was, and palliative care itself as a field is meant to help blow up the medical model a little bit and then welcome the emotional, the social, the spiritual aspects, the experience of living with illness, not just the transaction of trying to treat a disease. So palliative care in its base is trying to be this much bigger thing, this portal to upload other interests besides sort of molecular interests into the experience of care. So that's an aspiration for the field. So let me just digress a little bit more, because a lot of your listeners, you may have heard of palliative care, but it's generally conflated with hospice and end of life care. What's really important is, palliative care as a field did it grew out of the hospice. Hospice came first in this country. But in the 80s, hospice defined itself as an insurance benefit and limited this kind of care to people who had 6 months or less to live and who gave up to trying to cure their illness. So that's how you qualify for this kind of care called hospice in our country. Well, so that's lovely in a lot of ways, and many, many people have benefited from hospice. And I understand why the government put those limits on it back in the 80s, as to name this structure and to pay for it. But the truth is, of course, like, there's no magic to 6 months or less to live. It's not, and A, and B, we're terrible at prognosticating anyway. People often, either over or underdo our prognosis all the time. And so this crossroads, this fork in the road. Like, why would we ask someone to give up anything to get this kind of loving support? So the field of palliative care grew up in the 90s, trying to push to blow out the walls of these limits around this hospice idea. So now palliative care is simply the sort of interdisciplinary pursuit of quality of life. That's the cleanest way I might be able to put it. So, in that definition, any definition of palliative care, you won't see any mention of death. We don't run away from death, but we're not focused on death necessarily. And hospice is a subset of palliative care. It's a kind of palliative care that is devoted to the final months of life. But otherwise, palliative care, a lot of my patients, have years to live. A lot of when I was in the medical world at UCSF, I've had patients for 10 years. And so that's all backdrop to say, with Mettle Health, we wanted to take this aspiration, this potential for this philosophy, this approach to care, try to even make it bigger by pulling it outside of the healthcare structure, the limits that go with healthcare as an industry. Because if your subject matter is quality of life, abating suffering, finding joy, making meaning, these are not medical things. And so I realized that we were, in the healthcare structures, we were unnaturally curtailing or limiting the huge potential for this field to touch many more people, to be relevant to many more people. So for that was a big impulse of Mettle Health, was to pull it out of healthcare. We let go of the medical piece. I am a doctor, fine, and I'll talk to people about their medical things, but I'm not becoming someone's doctor through Mettle Health. That's an experience, a body, a skill set that I have that informs how I talk to people, but isn't the whole enchilada. And so I don't want to necessarily just become yet another doctor for people who often have too many doctors, but rather I will sometimes coach people how to use their doctors a little bit better, how to communicate with them, how to navigate this crazy healthcare system. So right. So we got rid of all the structures at LIM. We don't need a doctor's referral to come to us at Mettle Health. We have nothing to do with health insurance. And you don't even have to have a disease to qualify. Whereas if you were to find a conventional palliative care program, to qualify, you'd have to have some serious diagnosis. And here again, you bump into these man-made limits. We're trying to get rid of those man-made limits and open it wide open. So that's sort of the impulse for Sonia and me to start Mettle Health. So now enter our experience together, Gustavo. I mean, it's such a beautiful case in point. Like, first of all, you're not dying as far as we know anytime soon.
Well,
You're not
only insofar as we're all dying, right?
Right. Right. You're still in that club, right? We're in that club together too, right? But right, you have an indefinite lifespan ahead of you. You have, certainly you touch upon the medical system, but you are much more than a diagnosis. And way more, as you and I have experienced, way more about your diagnosis than most doctors anyway. So in this way, I'm not asking you to come into the healthcare system and medicalize yourself and hand yourself over to quote unquote experts who actually know less than you do. In this mental health way, we can sidle up to each other as fellow human beings and share and kind of talk things out together, reflect. I can help you sort of interpret the medical world a little bit and put it to good use for yourself, and leave the rest behind. And then you and I can, of course, we can wade into sort of issues of identity. How do we see ourselves with this disability stuff? Do we find the right words to describe our experience? Like, how do we transcend the words we're given, like disability, for example? So you and I, so you're a great case in point, whereas you might not qualify in a medical system for palliative care, or certainly not hospice. In our bigger picture way, you're super welcome with us at Mettle Health. So anyway, that's a long-winded, but it's sort of an explanation about how mental health, why it's a little bit different, why palliative care is a little bit different, and then why mental health within the purview of palliative care is itself a little different still. And then a little bit of a hit of what you and I can do together or have done together. But I'm curious to hear about your experience on the other end of it.
Absolutely. So my initial thinking, right, in approaching mental health and using the service was,
Mhm.
number one, everything that you said, it'd be interesting to talk to you about disability, how we perceive it, how I've learned to adapt with it. Um,
Mhm.
let's talk about prosthetics. What prosthetist might you know of that might be
Mhm.
better for me, right? Let's talk about our experiences with prosthetics. You were super helpful with that. But
Mhm.
I think on a deeper level, and this was something I'm still learning and was phenomenal, um, is how to approach doctors, because
Mhm.
I went to an institute recently that specializes in my condition.
Mhm.
And well, we'll start from the past here. So growing up, right? Um,
Mhm.
my parents, I was born in Brazil. My parents came to the States. They interviewed a bunch of doctors. My father happened to be a doctor, so it helped. From Canada, from Japan, from the United
Mhm.
States, from other areas in South America. And I'd say half of what my parents heard was, your son is never going to walk. He's going to crawl around the ground like a snake and,
Mhm.
you know, basically be a burden to society.
Mhm.
So there's clearly some trauma there and some things that
Mhm.
had to be worked out. There's clearly the idea of, even when I was young and the doctors were trying to help me, and we did discuss this, like, you're in a room, I'm in a room, basically in my underwear, and people are talking about me. I don't understand what they're saying. They're poking and prodding. They're trying to help,
Mhm.
but it's not a good experience.
Mhm.
So I saw this, again, it has been a long time since I had been to an institute like this. I've gone and seen, quote unquote, regular doctors. And to see
Mhm.
some parents who were hopeful, their kids, it's young children there. Some of them seem like they're doing great. Other parents, you see the desperation in their eyes, you see the
Mhm.
fear, you see the uncertainty. I experienced those things too. So it
Mhm.
really brought back a lot of old feelings, but we talked a lot about what kind of headspace should you be in when you go to see a doctor, because no matter what we're going to a doctor for, if it's something minor, if it's something major, we are more vulnerable. We don't know what they know. We don't understand what our options really are. Um,
Mhm.
and they can tell us anything. And if we're in the wrong mood, if we're weak, if we're not well informed, we could very well fall into some terrible outcomes.
Mhm.
And so it was really helpful. Like, it stuck with me. One of the things it said is, Gustavo, you don't owe the surgeon's ego anything,
Mhm.
right? Like, fuck their
Mhm.
ego.
Amen, brother. Yep.
So, and I found that was super helpful. How do you know? Like, I think so, maybe I'm wrong, but in my experience, I've heard stories, people that I've been interviewing, you hear it all the time. The word never, right? You're never going to
Mhm.
do this. You've had this accident. You're never going to be there. You were born this
Mhm.
way. You're never going to be able to do X.
Mhm.
That word to me seems like the biggest. Not only is it a poison in many ways, but why are we even using it when we have all these people that are showing us otherwise? Why even use that word at all
Yep.
as a doctor?
And let's see, I'm right. Let's start with the hypothesis that doctors, that healthcare in general is filled with people who mean well, right?
Correct.
Let's start with that thesis. I'm sure there are challenges to even that thesis, but in my experience, I, you know, I have, whether as a patient or as a physician, I have become convinced that by and large, people who go into debt to study health sciences just for the privilege of caring for another human being, that in its by itself, in its nature, that that pursuing a career in healthcare tends to attract people who really give a damn, you know? And so I believe that to be true. There are absolutely exceptions. But let's just start from there. And then you sort of then on top of that, those good intentions, of course, there's the medical training and the vernacular, the language, the habits, the culture of medicine. Then you throw all that stuff on top, the training, on top of those good intentions. And then you throw in outrageous busyness. This like the screws get turned tighter and tighter every year. You got to see more and more patients. You have less and less time. Life treatments are becoming more and more complicated. It's a mess. It's a hot mess. And so you put all that together, and out pops doctors who say dumb shit and and are so consumed with all those things that I just rattled off that they've had to tend to, et cetera, that their own openness, their own curiosity, their own kindness, their own warmth, their own thoughtfulness gets beat up and beat out. So one of the things when I'm talking to young medical students or nursing students or anybody else is to encourage them to protect their basic caring, compassionate selves that they're most likely bringing into the field. Like, you've got to protect that. The system by itself will beat that out of you. I don't think the system is inherently malevolent, but by its nature, we keep asking more and more of this system that's just not designed for this stuff. So one way or another, out pops these doctors saying and doing really lame things, hurtful things, which is, of course, it's just the height of irony that we in healthcare end up sworn to help people, we end up hurting people. And there are mountains of evidence to support that sad truth. Darn it. So anyway, that's a little sort of backdrop into your point here. So one way forward, um, I say all that to prime us on the receiving. I'm talking now as a patient, a fellow patient, quote unquote. For our own sake, it's very helpful for us to kind of know how to read what we're seeing. And I think it's in general helpful for us to understand why doctors are the way they are, not to forgive them, that's not to excuse them, rather. Um, but to at least understand, to be able to translate what we're seeing and hearing and feeling from these guys. Um, so that's one point. And so to get to your more focused question, though, words like never crop in because I bet at best, so again, starting with the hypothesis that these are well-intended efforts. So at best, I think that never word is probably from a doctor saying, gosh, I really need this family to understand this, that this is real. This is significant. This is going to take some effort, and to not casually just, I don't know what, just casually sort of underestimate what they're dealing with. And if we underestimate what we're dealing with, therefore we may not be prepared, may not plan accordingly, we may not give it the time and space that it requires. So at best, I think when people use that word, they're trying to get across like, hey, pay attention to this is serious, or whatever else. I want to manage your expectations, as it can be a kind thing to do. But so even if that's the intention, well, the truth is we shouldn't say stupid words like never, because we don't fucking know. Doctors are wrong all the time. To your point, there's evidence to the contrary all around if they're paying attention, but they're not paying attention because they're too damn busy and blah, 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 like we were saying. So around and around we'll go. But at my best, that's how I think words like that creep in. And why I would encourage you and myself and anybody else to feed back to those doctors, because otherwise I think we also have a reverence for doctors in some way that we don't speak up. We hand ourselves over, and our experience is relegated to sort of somehow less relevant than their own somehow. And in this way, we diminish ourselves and we pump up these doctors who, and frankly, I can tell you, as a physician, I don't enjoy that. Sometimes it feels nice that people think you're godly to be a doctor, but I don't enjoy that because I'm not God. I would much rather a patient treat me like a fellow human being. And for my own sanity's sake, like if someone coming at me that I'm going to work miracles, I've got to gently let them down and let them know I'm just another human being and I can't work miracles, etc. So we conspire to make our doctors arrogant, sadly. So part of the message here is no, treat them like a fellow human being and feed back and say, hey, doc, you really mean never? I don't know. If I saw this guy over here or that guy over here, or that word doesn't help me, whatever it is, I'd love us to get to a point where it's actually a fruitful exchange between human beings rather than a doctor up on high and this poor patient who knows nothing to down low, exposed, vulnerable in some ugly gown. So anyway, that's a little riff on your question about never. I mean, what do you think, brother?
I agree. That's why the experience is worthwhile, and why I love it, because I understand their perspective. I understand what they're going through and what their problems are. So that helps me not take it personally,
Exactly.
right? It gives me some objectivity. And then you gave me some new approaches. Ask them some questions. Be curious, be polite about it. Get into it with them just a little bit more on a human level. All of those things are super helpful because it's human to human, and it's not what you said. It's not this authority figure that you're looking up as some god who's going to fix all my problems.
Right on.
So absolutely, I agree 100%. It's also, do you think that if, say, a doctor said, well, look, the odds are against you, if I were to give you an estimate based on my experience, you're 80%, there's an 80% chance that you're going to have X out of this outcome, or there's a 10% chance, whatever it is. Do you think that that doesn't carry the right emotional weight, so that we kind of over exaggerate and use those words like never instead? Does
I,
probability not hit us the right way?
I think you're right about that. And part of medicine, in so many ways, is a reductive process. And certainly the healthcare system reduces our problems to a 15-minute encounter, and all this is insane. So I think you're right on there. There's a thread to make things, that reductive simplification process tends to make things concrete. Yes, no, always, never, black, white. Those are just more convenient, and they're more striking and they're easier to study, these dichotomous variables. The truth is, so much of life exists on a spectrum. It's all proportionality. It's not yes or no. It's sort of to what degree. And so I'd like to think that we'd all respond to more nuance, like 80% chance of this, 20% chance of that. Because in that we can hear both the likely reality and the possibility that it could be something else. But that takes time to communicate. That takes time to listen. You have to hear that in a certain way, and that begs for a more complicated conversation that can generally be had in a doctor's office unless you, the patient, push it. So yes, I think you're onto something. I think you're really onto something there. But you're also reminding me of a related tangent, which is we come up against this in prognostication when we're trying to offer prognoses. What I'd love your doctor to do, especially when you were younger, therefore more impressionable, but it really any encounter, it's not just faithfully transmitting information. That's not just the goal of a clinical encounter. That's important. But you got to kind of titrate that information to what the person is able to take in, is able to deal with. And so sometimes there's a time and a place to hold some silence and not foist data on another person. So I would love it if your doctor had asked, hey, Gustavo, would it be helpful for me to lend my experience and look down the road a little bit with you and try to guess where you might land 20 years from now? Would that be helpful to you, Gustavo? Because then you get to say, I don't know. The way I'm wired, if I hear that something may go a certain way, then all of a sudden then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And you know what really works for me, Doc, because thanks for asking. And boy, I feel your support and kindness, and you're allowing me to relax and actually think in your presence. Actually, why don't we take it sort of one day at a time? And when I'm ready to ask that kind of question, I'll circle back. And boy, do I appreciate the respect you just showed me by asking me whether to tell you anything. That's the way it really should go. What a different experience that would be, rather than bombarding and beating people up with information in the name of truthfulness, which often happens.
That would be amazing. And I can tell you that would be amazing even today. I would
Yeah.
love that question, if going to the doctor tomorrow, that would be beautiful.
Yes. And now, not now, Gustavo, these things, and a next follow-up sentence, and will come up in mental health visits with you and others, potentially would be, okay, so how about you telling your doctor, not waiting for them to ask, saying, hey, doc, before we go any further, I'm the kind of guy who likes information a certain way, so we patients, we don't have to wait for medical education to shift and the pressures on doctors to wane, and we can participate in our own care, of course, and we can participate in getting the kind of care that serves us well from our doctor by telling them what we need and how we need to hear things. So that's the next level. That's the next layer of sort of taking that responsibility onto ourselves. And helping to craft this experience in a way that's actually going to serve us rather than squash
Absolutely. In a kind of an interesting tangent, but I have an important question too, but an interesting tangent is my favorite clients in what I do on my day job are the people who have a good idea of what they want and what they like and what they care about, and they tell me, look, I'm really into music. I want the greatest musical experience you can give me, or I don't really care about X, but this is what I want to accomplish. That helps me enormously to do a better job serving them. So I think that's that's a beautiful point that we can carry over to a whole bunch of different professions and a whole bunch of different contexts.
Totally. Yep. Amen, brother. Yep.
I'm super curious to know, when you were a clinician and you were practicing as a doctor, how did you protect protect that humanity? How did you not let the system beat it out of you?
Well, I was lucky in that I had this big time experience of being a patient myself and coming close to death and having engaged the healthcare system before I entered it as a student. So I had a lot more experience than my peers of how medicine actually plays out and how the difference between what the textbooks are telling you and the experience in the hospital or an exam room or whatever. So that was a huge leg up for me going in, on top of my own experience of being the son of a woman, of a mother who had polio and post-polio syndrome. So I've been around disability my whole life, and that experience certainly informed, that helped me I was never really, it was not a big risk that I was going to somehow play into this doctor knows everything, patient knows nothing crap. I had, by virtue of my own experiences in my family and my own personally, I was already, I was pre-washed, so I knew as I went through the training, and it felt like such an advantage. I felt like, which is an interesting statement because you might look at a guy missing 3 limbs in medical school and see that as a disadvantage. In so many ways, I felt like I had a really wonderful leg up, excuse the pun. So that's a big, so just knowing that going in was really, really important, as you can imagine. And then, but more to the meat of your question, I was just careful in the same way we're saying the medical model is powerful, but it's not to be confused with everything. It's not the only way to see. It's not the only way to understand reality. I had already known that too by studying the arts. And so I made sure to hang out with friends who were not in healthcare. When I was a student, I lived a little farther away from campus. I was sure to made sure to protect my non-medical interests because I knew those were going to inform me staying a good, or I don't know, good human being or something like that. So those were some of the tricks for me. And that meant playing with art, music, getting outside, getting on my bike, doing anything but medicine, but that's still related to the human experience, because I always knew that medicine was on behalf of the human experience, not the other way around.
Brilliant. That's amazing. As we kind of, wind down here, I want to be protective of your time. Question I ask everybody is, what have I missed that you think is really important to talk about?
Oof, that's a good, big, generous question, Gustavo. Let me think about that for a moment. I suppose, here's where my mind goes. Obviously, there's all sorts of things we haven't talked about, but boy, did we cover some good stuff from where I sit. Big stuff. I suppose I'm tempted. Well, I'm going to say my answer is that what's popping to mind now is to make sure to caveat, as you and I are speaking, with some casual, with a little bit of comfortable distance from some of the more painful moments of our lives, some of the more painful experiences that we're talking about now, kind of dispassionately. But just to note that this stuff gets really hard. And even if we know it should be otherwise, or it could be different, like we're talking about all our aspirations here and how to understand things, I just want to note that, no matter how you slice it, even when we get great care, even when we stumble and find a doctor who we really light up with and who understands us and all that stuff, just to make a little note here that it can still be painful as hell. It can still be confusing as hell. So I don't want to, well, I guess my point here is I don't want us to accidentally alienate or orphan the harder feelings, the harder thoughts that are there to no matter what happens. And just to remind each other that the human experience includes disappointment, suffering, pain, no matter how you slice it. Those aren't always a failing of some system somewhere. They're facts of life. And so the perspective that you and I are sharing now has come from many, many years of wading through all sorts of things where you and I didn't know where we were headed, didn't know the answer, didn't know anything,
A
So
a lot of hard emotional labor. Absolutely.
Yes. And in some way, we are reaping the benefits of having gone through those, even the ability to sit with each other and talk about these things in an untraumatized way. So I want to just acknowledge the work that goes into getting where you and I are. And to note too, in case any listeners worry that you and I have some secret knowledge and are just forever happy people because we figured everything out. Hell no. I'll forget everything we just talked about and have to relearn it tomorrow. And even when I remember all the things we're talking about, life can still suck. Life can still be really hard. I can be really close to giving up, throwing in the towel, wanting to get off this planet, get off this ride as much as I love it. So I guess my point is here just to make a little, to dog ear the hard stuff, the impossible stuff, the questions that don't have answers. They need to have a place in this mix too.
They do. And for me, having understanding friends, family, people that I could talk to, that I could trust, that weren't going to judge me,
Mm-hmm.
um, immensely valuable. I
Mm-hmm.
think what you're doing with Mettle Health, immensely valuable in that aspect too, because you are counseling, you are building a community, and I think you're holding space for all of those feelings and all of those emotions. And when we talk about it together, it helps. Even when things are shitty, even when things are difficult, it helps.
Mm-hmm. Ah, you're so, I fucking love you, Gustavo. That's so nice to hear, brother. Thank you. I mean, that is our intention with Mental Health. And sure, we're going to miss the mark sometimes, but that is exactly the effect we are trying to achieve. So thanks for feeling it and coming along with me. And I can't wait till our next visit now, man. Yeah,
Me
I hope we'll
neither.
have some more.
So BJ, where can people find you? Where can people reach out? How can people learn more about mental health?
Well, so obviously the website, mettlehealth.com, is a place to go. And on there, if you have questions or whatever, that is a work in progress. Sonia and I are building this thing, as you know well, on a shoestring. So, we're welcome feedback. And as you and I are talking, we're trying to kind of find language for huge experiences. And so we may not get our language just right. People may not see themselves in our site, but really everyone and everything is welcome. Every issue is welcome here. So have a look at the website, shoot us an email, give us a call if you're wondering, you want to talk further. We offer 20-minute free consultations with me in there. There's a place to start. It doesn't cost anything, just to kind of see where we are and see if we can help each other. So I'd point you there. I'm on Twitter at BJ Miller MD, I think it is. And Mettle Health, we are on Instagram, Mettle_health, and Twitter as well. So those are some places to find us. And I guess I'll say one more plug. Is I did work on a book, co-wrote a book with my friend Shoshana Berger, and Sonia was our partner in that too. And that book is another way to kind of get at some of the things we've talked about. And that's called A Beginner's Guide to the End. Simon & Schuster published it 2 years ago now or so, and that's out in the world as well.
Phenomenal. I'm gonna pick that one up. I haven't read it yet. So look,
Hmm.
last thing I want to say, I appreciate you so much. I was telling Sonia yesterday via email that
Mm.
my first interaction with you was through Tim Ferriss's podcast, and
Mm.
the many, many years ago. And I remember thinking then, wouldn't it be incredible just, just to meet you,
Mm.
just to say thank you. And here we are now, much more engaged, uh,
Mm.
helping each other, learning from each other. And I'm just so grateful that the opportunity came up. And I thank you so much for being here, for helping me, for being a part of this.
Gustavo, thank you, brother. That goes both directions, pal. I am thrilled to be your friend and colleague and whatever other words you'd put to us. So thank you, buddy.
Very welcome. All right. Thank you so much, BJ.
All right. Take care, bud. Till next time.